I am Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aethers, and welcome back to the Darla YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this video, we are going to be talking about really a question. This is a continuation of a series that I started on my channel a number of months ago. This is the second video in the series. They're not like two-parters. You can watch them in any order. They're just covering similar topics. So it's not like one of those you need to go back and watch. They're just on related subjects, and that is my Severity series. My Severity series is a series where I'm exploring severe, harsh, and hard topics in the religious sphere. The challenging things that a lot of people are afraid of addressing and looking at from a more mystical perspective. And in this video, we're going to be talking about evil entities, and specifically this question that exists and underlies a lot of religions. What is the most evil spirit that exists? This really comes from an idea of metaphysical evil, which is something that appears really in every tradition, but in very different ways. In many traditions, specifically those that have a more dualist worldview, there is sort of a good and an evil, a virtue and a vice built into that paradigm. And this tends to manifest in specific entities that are kind of the embodiment of this. And this is an idea that if you were in the West, you're probably really, really familiar with. So we're going to go through a bunch of different religions, their theories on the most evil entity, what that looks like in their religion, and then in traditions where metaphysical evil is a little bit less cut and dry or that don't have the same dualist framework, how this appears in those, and how as esotericists this can be relevant to us from that perspective. I'm going to begin this video with addressing Christianity, not typically a place that I start in my videos, but I think a lot of people, when they hear the concept of the video, that is where their brain is first going to go. So there's kind of three entities that appear as the most evil entity in Christianity, and all of them are actually a lot more interesting than it seems. And funnily enough, there's a pretty good case that they might not be the same entity. So let's go through them. The first one is going to be Satan. So Satan is a title. Generally, this is an argument a lot of people make, that it means adversary. It translates to adversary. And that is true, but the idea that Satan is just a title and not an entity kind of falls flat when you look at the Jewish tradition, where Ha-Satan is a figure. Now, this one is the less developed, though I am going to talk about a very similar idea that uses the term shaitan a little later in the video, but fundamentally, yes, Satan is a title, but also Satan does represent something. Now, the next would be the devil. So the devil as a figure is interesting because it is not mentioned super heavily in the Bible. You see the names Satan and Lucifer the most, with the devil mentioned the least. And a lot of our imagery that we associate with the devil comes quite a bit later. A lot of it actually comes from European folklore. This idea of this horned entity, this man in black figure, is a composite of a lot of different mythos. A lot of people have argued that Pan was the main influence for our vision for what the devil looks like. But if you look across Europe, you will see a number of entities that kind of match this profile. I think a lot of people bring up, I'm going to mispronounce this, my apologies, Cyrenius, the Celtic god. I think that's a very bad thing to pin the devil to, because Cyrenius is not, doesn't have a lot of these evil traits that are associated with the devil. He's just kind of like a nature god. Whereas Pan, I can see more people get that connection because Pan represents this very feral, wild, and dark side of the self. Pan fundamentally represents the lower impulses of the human being and those primal urges, which Christianity, as we know, is a tradition that is about sort of breaking beyond those lower urges in favor of something higher and more virtuous. So that's kind of where we get that. In a lot of folklore, you'll see different names pop up. Specifically, the man in black is an interesting one because that's one that doesn't really seem to have any really biblical connection, but does seem to exist in the European consciousness. Now let's turn to Lucifer, arguably the most interesting of these figures within the Christian worldview. So Lucifer was actually a fallen angel. Lucifer was God's favorite, and then Lucifer committed the sin of pride by, when God told him to bow before humans, he refused. It is generally argued that angels do not have free will within the Christian worldview, and only humanity has free will, that being God's gift to humanity, and why humans would later go on to commit the original sin of eating the apple and inventing sin as a concept, because they use their free will to choose against God. As I've said before, the majority of sin within any religion is essentially choosing the material over the spiritual. And God, within the Christian worldview, gave humans the option to choose the material over the spiritual, fundamentally making them sins. Now, Lucifer's interesting because this does kind of go against this free will idea that is arguably only given to humans. You can make two arguments off of this. Either one, angels had their free will redacted after Lucifer's rebellion, or two, God essentially planned this. You can make a number of different arguments about this, but fundamentally, Lucifer rebels, and the angels kind of pick sides, whether they're going to side with God and kneel before humans, or pick Lucifer and refuse to kneel for humans, and then they fell. Then once they fell, you have a number of different narratives emerge. In some less common tellings of Christianity, some more heretical sects, you'll kind of see a really interesting figure emerge, Azazel, who is one of the fallen angels, sometimes written as Zazel. Azazel, interestingly, as a sigil, has the same sigil as Saturn. A lot of people have theories about Saturn as a spirit being a very antinomian one. It is marked, Saturn is a planet, an astronomical and astrological planet that also is named after the Roman Titan Saturnus, who is the same figure as Kronos, the Titan that when the Olympians grew, he ate his son to prevent them from taking his power. It is argued that Saturn and Kronos, I'm going to lump them together, ruled over a golden era, and then when the Olympians took over, their power was taken, they were cast down, they were chained up, and then the Olympians took power. There's an interesting theory that there's a connection between Azazel and Saturn. Their sigils are very similar, and a lot of their attributions are similar. And what's interesting about Azazel and these more heterodox tellings of Christianity is that Azazel actually came to Earth and taught humans a number of skills, including makeup. So, the original makeup beauty guru. There's a bunch of things that argue that Azazel taught humanity, which interestingly parallels a lot of pagan myths about a sort of controversial figure who would come down to humanity and teach humanity things that they were not supposed to know, yet once they know it, you cannot put it back in the box. Pandora's box is another telling of this, right? Humans heard too much and it opened this box and out came all the evils of the world, but also the one bit of hope. We see how this parallels the Adam-Eve story I mentioned earlier, right? The snake in the Garden of Eden gave Eve this apple, and when she bit into it, she was given knowledge, but also fallen from grace. Interestingly, most Christians believe this fall from grace is permanent, yet there is one sect, an esoteric sect, that comes out of the Victorian logical tradition known as the Martinists. They run a group called the Martinist Order who believe that through mysticism, humans can undo the fall entirely. Redacting original sin is a mistake that was made through righteousness and through closeness to God and Jesus. They are a strictly Christian order, though of course Orthodox and Catholic sects do see them as heretics, as they often do. Now, to the snake of the Garden of Eden, there's an interesting theory that comes off of this snake that would make this snake perhaps the most evil entity of all, not Satan, Lucifer, devil, etc. that we have gone through. And this takes us out of traditional Christianity and into esotericism. John Dee was a Christian mystic who was a court astrologer. He was very well respected in England, though there were some controversies around him. He had this very famous critic who argued that he was a secret, evil occultist wizard man who was not a mystic, but someone who was doing something far more nefarious. Regardless of how you feel about John Dee, many have written him in history as one of the greatest Christian mystics who have ever lived. You can all argue about that in the comments. And he was someone who would develop an entire system of mysticism and magic known as the Enochian system. The Enochian system is something that he would scribe with his partner, Edward Kelly. And he believed he was getting communications from Enochian angels, a specific type of angel that he had discovered. Within the Abrahamic worldview, angels are broadly accepted, though the idea of angel does predate Christianity. Both in Christianity, there's a number of classes of angels, there are different types of angels. This also exists in the Judaic tradition and to some extent in the Islamic tradition, and a number of pagan traditions agree with this as well. But what he saw is he encountered this entity that he would name Choronzon. He argued that Choronzon was the snake in the Garden of Eden. This would be further elaborated upon by one of John Dee's successors, Sir Aleister Crowley, the prophet and founder of Thelema, who would agree with this take and would argue that Choronzon as an entity is the most evil entity of them all, and that he sits at the bottom of the abyss. Within the Thelemic paradigm, the occultist journey is sort of explained through a number of things, and the Tree of Life is often used as a model for it. And he argued that Choronzon sat at the bottom of the abyss or died. And as the Magus progressed through his spiritual evolution, he would at one point have to cross the abyss, undergoing what many traditions call the dark night of the soul. And at the bottom of this was Choronzon, as I previously mentioned, and the mystic would be challenged, he would be tested, and he would either sink or swim. And if he was sunk, he would be taken by Choronzon and fundamentally ruined and broken. This is why a lot of people argue that Aleister Crowley started to lose it in his later periods of life. Obviously, his peak was when he was not too young, but kind of in his mid-early life, when he was completing a lot of his great rituals. And then, as we all know, as he got later into life, he experienced a specific ritual that went wrong. He stepped outside of the circle and had a big spiritual problem happen, and there was a period where it's a really dark phase. Many argue that this is what that is from. Choronzon is seen as universally malefic, even in the traditions that are less dualistic in their view. Though there would be one occultist, Kenneth Grant, who would explore Choronzon deeper and create a slightly different view of him. Now, another entity that is often cited as the most evil entity of all, and this is we're going to look to the Gnostic traditions, is the Demiurge. So Gnosticism is fundamentally a break-off of Christianity. It is not separate, and it is not anti-Christianity. I think a lot of people conflate Gnosticism with a lot of things that they don't like. Gnosticism gets conflated with everything. Gnosticism, what it is, if we're going to be technical, is a series of traditions that broke off of Christianity, that were heretical sects that valued things like gnosis and had a few overlapping theological beliefs. This is the most common Gnostic belief. Obviously, different Gnostics view it slightly different ways. We're talking about a lot of different sects. But basically what these sects believe is that there is sort of two gods, right? They are monotheistic traditions, though a lot of people who would take influence from Gnosticism later on with the Neo-Pagan revival and the Occult revival would become non-monotheistic traditions. They would become very polytheistic, but Gnosticism itself is a monotheism. I guess you could argue it's a duotheism. Basically what it is there's a true God that created this entire universe. And within that, there is the Demiurge, a false god and a tyrant who created this specific universe. And fundamentally, we are ruled by him. Now, this gets interesting when Jesus enters the picture, because a number of Gnostic sects say that Jesus is an embodiment of the true God. And that would explain why I'm sure we've heard this take from normies in our lives. The Old Testament God is evil, the New Testament God is great. It's this argument, but solidified into a different worldview. Now, there are some Gnostics who see the Demiurge in a slightly more nuanced way. The Valentinians are the perfect example of that, but there are some people who would argue that the Demiurge himself is the ultimate evil entity. Now, some neo-Gnostics, modern Gnostics, take this even further and argue that there is fundamentally a tyrant god that a lot of different religions are worshiping. A lot of different religions are fundamentally worshiping the Demiurge, right? And there's this weird thing where all religions, when you reduce them down, come back to this one entity. And so we must create a new path away from this entity to find truth and to escape this paradigm. Now, I'm going to be moving away from the Christian tradition towards the Islamic world. I have often argued that the Islamic world and the Islamic traditions are not a continuation of the Abrahamic lineage that people often claim they are. I do stand by this belief. I feel this way because fundamentally their theologies are very different and the historicism does not quite line up. I do believe the Islamic tradition is a very powerful tradition, but I think it is fundamentally different than Christianity or Judaism, though I would take it really far and argue that perhaps Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all less connected than we are often taught to believe. But in Islam, there is a specific entity that is cited as the most evil entity, Iblis. So Iblis is actually not a fallen angel, so we're already seeing a departure from the Christian view. In fact, Iblis is a jinn. So jinn are a very important class of spirits within the Islamic and the broader Arabian worldview. It does appear that the jinn predate Islam, and the jinn are interesting because there are good jinn and bad jinn. We don't see this with demons. I guess you could argue we see this with fallen angels versus regular angels, but it's a very different view. And the most evil of the jinns are shaitan. It is often believed that every single human has a jinn attached to them. And some people have believing jinn and some people have disbelieving jinn or shaitans linked to them, influencing their every decision. Now, Iblis is sort of the greatest of these shaitans, and he is the figure that embodies this role in that tradition. His lore is just a little bit different. There are a number of things that don't quite line up compared to the previous one, but he is a distinct figure who has a distinct story to him. Now, if we step outside of these traditions, we are going to get to many earlier religions or pagan religions. And I think people get paganism wrong. I think there is a belief, especially because of neo-pagan movements, that the pagans thought every god was yay, happy, good, and that you should worship every god. This is simply not the case. A number of pagan traditions cite specific deities as kind of malevolent, if not evil. This is not every pagan tradition. I'm not speaking broadly. There are some that do not follow this at all, and there are some that argue all the gods are good, and there are some that address the problem of evil, or that a giant apologetics question of why does evil exist in this world, in very different ways. But there are some that blame it on very specific entities or deities. Now, there are some that blame it on spirits that are not the gods. In the Celtic world, you see a lot of it blamed on the Fae, which I know people think fairies are happy-go-lucky creatures in the modern consciousness, but they certainly were not that in the consciousness of historic people. In fact, in Wales, there really wasn't a witch hunt. There was a hunt on people who they believed had fairy blood, which resulted in a lot of people dying because they thought they were Fae. So, not viewed as our friends. And then there are, once again, evil spirits within the pagan worldview. Most pagan traditions had an idea of evil spirits. There's a lot of folklore and customs and traditions and symbols that we objectively know were used to deter evil spirits. But yes, there were some pagan traditions who kind of viewed specific gods as evil, especially if you get into individual cults. Because we have to remember, even within one nation, not all people approached their religion the same. Largely people worshipped specific spirits, specific deities. So you're going to see some variance. We're talking about a lot of different religions that kind of existed at the same time. So this is addressed entirely differently depending on what specific pagan religion you are looking at. So why as practitioners does any of that matter? Why does this affect us? Why do we need to care? Well, you need to know all this if you are going to approach a practice. I think a lot of the big problem with online occultism, and I've said this a few times, is people don't think about theological consistency. They don't think logically. They just think, I'm going to do what works quickly, and not consider why that might not lead to a conductive practice. When you are working with spirits, when you are worshiping spirits, you're going to be impacted by whatever it is that you interact with. It is going to seep into your body of light and fundamentally affect you. And so we need to remember this and realize that there are, in fact, spirits that it is not a good idea to work with. There's a reason why, if we look at ancient ways, the few mystics who did work with evil spirits approached it, it was not through worship, it was through binding them through higher powers so that they could not hurt us, then do our bidding in that way. It was not this all spirits good thing. If you think all spirits are good, you're gonna have a really bad time metaphysically. The idea of the imposter spirit or an evil spirit masquerading as a good spirit or a god to trick a practitioner into worshiping them is an idea that goes so far back. And so maybe consider, is this god on my team? Does this god work out for me? Does this spirit look out for me? And, you know, when you're forming your practice, consider all of this. I'm very curious what god, entity, or spirit you guys think takes the title of the most evil spirit. I think a number of figures in this video have a argument for getting it. And what's so interesting is there's a number of spirits in this video who some people would argue might not be evil at all. So let me know your thoughts. Like, comment, subscribe. You can find me on all sorts of platforms. I'm on Instagram. I just joined Threads, TikTok, Twitter, Telegram, Substack, and Patreon. This channel is supported by Patreon. Please join. I give an extra video every month, early access to all my videos, ritual guides, all sorts of things, and I have access to a Telegram group chat where you can all talk, hang out with me, and spend some time with me. It's all very, very fun. All right, I'll see you guys in the next one. The Severity series is coming back. I'm not going to wait this long before posting another one next time. My big next video on this series, I think, is going to be what is evil, metaphysical evil, and that idea. So stay tuned, like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you subscribe for 93 days, you meet your holy guardian angel and you want to just think about any of these questions ever again. Bye.